quick note about the organization of this presentation. For the most part, it is presented chronologically, broken up by era. The events and people are presented through the lens of a church historian, engaging God at work in his church by engaging the four marks of the church, Cardinal Dulles' models of the church, and the themes of church and state, faith and reason, and religious pluralism, as expressed in Western civilization. Some historical examples are included merely out of personal interest. A high school student of mine once wrote in a paper that the Catholic religion is a large and complicated book, and that key to comprehending it more fully is to learn from the faithful disciples who have walked with Christ for over 2,000 years. With this in mind, my goal is to provide a brief introduction to American Catholic history, a latecomer on the scene in the life of the universal church. My foremost hope is that it will help, in particular the Catholic Christian viewer, see the hopes and joys, challenges and failures of this particular part of the body of Christ, the Church in America, so that one can more clearly and confidently celebrate the joys and be aware of the failures of today, and like every generation, hope in the risen Christ for a tomorrow more rooted in God's love. Author Charles R. Morris wrote in the preface to his 1997 book, American Catholicism, "It has always been as much a culture as a religion, one defined by its prickly apartness from the broader, secular American culture. In America, usually enthusiastically for America, but never quite of America." Let us take a look at the apartness, enthusiasm, and uniqueness that Morris refers. As seen on this map, in 1750, the Christian colonial powers that influenced what would be the future United States were the French Catholics, depicted here in purple, the Spanish Catholics, depicted here in orange, and British Protestants, shown here in green. First, New France's sphere of influence, depicted here in blue. It was not until a few years ago that I became more aware of the French presence in American history. I had thought that it was, for the most part, limited to Quebec, New Orleans, and fur trappers in the Midwest. But when my son and I went on a road trip to the Northeast, we visited Sainte Marie among the Iroquois, pictured here, a 17th century French Jesuit mission located in the middle of the Onondaga Nation. It was located close to Syracuse, New York. The original mission was in use only for 3 years, from 1656 to 1659. In the 1930s, a replica of the mission was built on a bluff overlooking the Onondaga Lake as part of the Works Progress Administration, or WA program. Next, New Spain's sphere of influence, depicted here. It's much familiar to me since I grew up in California. Little did I know that Spain's reach included Florida. Martin de Argüelles, Jr., born 1566, died in 1630, represented here by his family's coat of arms, was the first white child known to have been born in what is now the United States. His birthplace of St. Augustine, Florida, is the oldest continuously occupied European-founded city in the United States. Martin's birth was some 20 years before Virginia Dare's birth, the first child born in North America to English parents. Last, British America's sphere of influence, depicted here. was diverse when it came to Protestant Christianity. Catholics and Jews were minorities. Maryland was founded by to be a refuge for Catholics. Pictured here is the Catholic Mayflower. In fact, there were two. The Ark and the Dove arrived March 25, 1634, after a 5-month trip from England. Passengers were actually predominantly Protestant. Maryland will never become a majority Catholic. They came with money, though. In terms of practicing the faith, they did so in private. The Maryland Act of Toleration of 1649 was broadly ecumenical. 5 years later, it will be repealed in favor of Puritans. In 1691, Maryland became a royal colony, and the Church of England became the established religion in 1692. Most Catholics in Maryland were of the gentry class and had some wealth, but will be repressed off and on and have to worship in private. The few Jesuit priests who did come from England would minister their flock in secret. Pictured here is Charles Carroll. Known as Charles Carroll of Carrollton, or Charles Carroll III, to distinguish him from his similarly named relatives. He was a wealthy Maryland planter and an early advocate of independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain, and one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. His cousin, John, would become the first Catholic bishop and archbishop in the United States. As diverse as these community of disciples were, they clearly were part of the one body of Christ. We also see at work in the previous examples the theme of church and state. Catholic Christianity in the New World. Spain was mainly motivated by a mix of wealth, land, and empire, spreading the Catholic faith, introduced agricultural economy, and did this by setting up missions. The French, however, also for religious zeal, but the economy was generally built around furs and trapping, not agriculture. Therefore, no structured employment communities were set up. English colonies, very unique. Christian religious diversity, as I stated earlier. By the late 17th century, British North America colonies included Puritans in New England, Anglicans in Virginia, Quakers, Dissenters in Pennsylvania, and Middle colonies, and as I said earlier, Catholics in Maryland. As the following is intended to help one recognize the transition from the Catholic reality during Spanish, French, and English colonial times to an immigrant church. The Catholic population transformed into an incredible, diverse mass of urban and rural immigrants, according to Julie Byrne, currently in the Department of Religion at Fordham, in her 2000 article while at Duke. Until about 1845, Catholics were a small minority, mainly of English heritage and wealthy. However, in around 50 years, the Catholic population transformed into an incredibly diverse mass of urban and rural immigrants from many different countries who spoke different languages, held different social statuses, and emphasized different parts of their Catholic heritage. It is no wonder that with such great numbers in a short period, the Protestant majority, with its criticism of hierarchy and affinity for congregationalism and evangelicalism, just see stories of Cotton Mather, lacking in a tradition of sacramental theology and sole inspiration from the Bible, praying to the saints for intercession rather than directly to God, showed anti-Catholicism. Catholics generally became ghettoized or in neighborhoods with Catholics from the same ethnic group. They really were little communities of disciples learning the faith that was brought with them from Europe. For example, German Catholics had little interaction with Irish Catholics. The question soon raised was, from the Protestant elite point of view, can Catholics be good Americans? From the Catholic elite perspective, how can Catholics be both faithful and American? It seemed that the mark of the Church, one, was having growing pains. Here we see the booming immigration, and here we have major urban areas in the United States between 1860 to 1900, population 1860s, 1880s, and 1900s. But the main reason I wanted to point this out is here we have the numbers from Italy, Austria-Hungary, Poland, Germany, France, Ireland, Russia, Norway, and Sweden. And on the west coast, with the major entry point at Angel Island from Japan and China. But what's noteworthy here is, for the Catholic Church in American history presentation, the majority of the Italians coming from Austria-Hungary, Poland, Germany, France, Ireland were of course Catholic. According to an essay titled Nativist Riots of 1844 by Zachary M. Schrag, professor of history at George Mason University, found on the website The Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia, life was a struggle for the new Catholic immigrant. This lithograph depicts key elements of one of the riots of 1844. The image portrays the fight that took place in the South Wark neighborhood on July 7, 1844. Schrag shares, in May and July 1844, Philadelphia suffered some of the bloodiest rioting of the antebellum period, as anti-immigrant mobs attacked Irish American homes and Roman Catholic churches before being suppressed by the militia. The violence was part of a wave of riots that convulsed American cities, starting in the 1830s. Yet even amid this tumult, they stand out for their duration, itself a product of nativist determination to use xenophobia for political gain. Those Catholics and their graven images of saints and statuses was what many Protestants thought of Catholics. The Eliot School Rebellion was a 19th century incident that played a significant role in the debate over what kind of Christian instruction would be available in American public schools and sparked the establishment of Catholic parochial schools nationwide. At Boston's Eliot School, instructor Miss Sophia Shepherd demanded that her student, a Catholic 10-year-old boy named Thomas Wall, to recite the King James Version of the Ten Commandments, and he said he would not. She would end up beating the boy's hand with a rattan stick for half an hour until they were cut and bleeding. Eventually, the school and parents could not agree on how to handle the defiance of Catholics, and around 100 Catholic youngsters left the school. The theme of faith and reason is at work here. No person should be compelled to go against their conscience. Paragraph 1782 of the Catechism, quoting the Second Vatican Council Fathers' document of the dignity of the human person, shares, quote, "Man has the right to act in conscience and in freedom, so as personally to make moral decisions. He must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters." The St. Patrick's Battalion was formed and led by John Riley. It was a unit of 175 to 700, accounts vary, immigrants and expatriates of Irish descent who fought as part of the Mexican Army against the United States in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Most of the battalion's members had deserted or defected from the United States Army. The Irish-American immigrant soldiers who deserted felt they had more in common with the Catholic Mexican. At first glance, it seems, they believed they were members of the body of Christ before they were members of the body politic. Quick summary of this. The French parish, established in 1874, where 250 Franco-American families worshipped and around 40 Irish families. In 1882, the Irish broke off and formed their own parish. When the French priest died suddenly, the bishop sent McGee, who was Irish-Canadian and spoke French. In December 1884, McGee was locked out and even threatened with violence. The church would be vandalized. Police were called in to keep the peace even during Mass. Father McGee asked for another assignment, and the bishop, Thomas Hendrickson, pictured here, complied. In February 1885, the bishop ended up closing the church. The French sent a representative to the Holy See to plead their case. He had 2 audiences with Pope Leo XIII. They were afraid of secession. The bishop felt it, if the French prevailed, he'd lose all control. He put another Irish priest in charge of the parish, and protests and boycotts ensued. The bishop ended closing it again. The Pope demanded a compromise. In September 1885, the bishop opened the church, again with an Irish pastor. However, the Irish pastor had a French assistant. On March 21, 1886, the assistant took over due to the Irish pastor's death. So what's the takeaway of this story? It seems that the seed that was planted by European missionaries had turned into a family bickering with each other. In other words, the model of the church community of disciples along ethnic lines seemed paramount. The Library of Congress website notes on its immigration page that, quote, both the Irish and blacks had reason to feel they were treated unfair in the workforce, and often at one another's expense, end quote. Here is an example from history that supports that. Here we see a recruiting poster for the Enrollment Act, or Civil War Military Draft Act of the federal government, for the conscription of troops for the Union Army in New York City on June 23, 1863. The New York City draft riots, known at the time as Draft Week, were violent disturbances in Lower Manhattan, widely regarded as a culmination of white working class discontent with the new laws passed by Congress that year to draft men to fight in the ongoing American Civil War. Basically, if you could afford to pay $300, you could get out of military service. The working class Irish in New York City would have none of it, because they couldn't afford $300, and began rioting on July 11, 1863, taking their anger out on their economic competitors, free blacks. One of the targets was a 4-story building, Colored Orphan Asylum, and was burned down by the mob. Providence, in quick thinking, spared the 233 youths from death or injury. The riots were ultimately suppressed by government troops on July 16, 1863. The chaos resulted in 119 to 120 deaths, 2,000 injuries, and in 2013 dollars, $27.5 million in property damage, roughly. Dr. Kathleen Zapila, assistant professor of art history at Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia, noted in her 2002 American Catholic Studies article, Lest We Forget, that the 1924 dedication was the first of its kind, a monument dedicated in the nation's capital honoring vowed Catholic sisters. On the granite above the relief is inscribed, "They comforted the dying, nursed the wounded, carried hope to the imprisoned, gave in his name a drink of water to the thirsty." On the granite below the relief, it reads, "To the memory and in honor of the various orders of sisters who gave their services as nurses on battlefields and in hospitals during the Civil War." The Civil War Catholic religious sisters were exemplars of the church as servant, caring for the body that houses the soul. This is also a great example of the theme religious pluralism. The sisters help those in need no matter their creed. Now let us move on to an example of the model of the church as institution. First, some context. This definition from the Catholic Encyclopedia, the old one, from the year 1912. Americanism is defined as the church should adapt to the new advanced civilization and relax her disciplines regarding not only the rule of life but also the deposit of faith, passing over or minimizing certain points of doctrine, or giving to them a new meaning which the church had never held. In short, the bishops were concerned with how to properly be both Catholic and American. So 4 plenary councils in Baltimore will be held. One in the year 1852, the other 1866, and the last in 1884. And there the bishops in the United States discussed matters of the Catholic faith in America. Eventually, 2 groups formed. One side would be headed by Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore, Bishop Ireland of St. Paul, who argued that Catholics could find common values within American democracy, or basically adapt. Pope Leo XIII here will hear from both sides, this and the other side led by Bishop Hughes of New York City, who argued for loyalty to the Pope and being distinctly Catholic. Eventually, Pope Leo XIII would write, "Witness to our goodwill," and it would be directed to Cardinal James Gibbons, Archbishop of Baltimore, who led the bishops in the United States and was dated January 22nd, 1899. In it, the Pope addressed a heresy he called Americanism and expressed his concern that the American Church should guard against American values of liberalism and pluralism that undermined the doctrine of the Church. Christians for time immemorial found meaning in being co-creators with God in working the land, as seen on the cover of Descartes' Discourse. A major shift, the Industrial Revolution, comes out of the predominantly Protestant nations. Here we see 2 images that speak to the transformation in America. Here we see the Boston Manufacturing Company, 1813-1816, in Massachusetts. And then just some little over a decade later, DeWitt Clinton, the governor, pouring a bucket full of Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean to mark the opening of the Erie Canal. So man was going from co-creator and transitioning into a whole way of a new way of making understanding and making economy, being a participant in the economy, and their role and purpose in that. A pioneer of speaking out for the rights of workers was Terence V. Powderly. Being a devout Catholic, he worked with Bishop James Gibbons of Baltimore to persuade the Pope to remove sanctions against Catholics who joined unions. The Catholic Church had opposed the unions as too influenced by rituals of Freemasonry, which had an anti-Catholic bent, and they took secret oaths. The Knights of Labor, which Powderly founded and organized and led, had the words "the Holy and Noble Order" removed from the name of the Knights of Labor in 1882 and abandoned any membership rituals associated with Freemasonry. Just shy of a decade later, Pope Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, in English, The Condition of Labor, a fantastic example of the theme of faith and reason. The pontiff wrote in the letter about the excesses of communism and capitalism. The latter, though corresponding to many Christian values, had excesses too, like applying biological theories in the marketplace, known as social Darwinism. The former tried to control the human person and was anti-religion. One man who took the words of the Pope and put them into action was Father York, who spoke up for workers' rights during the general strike in San Francisco, July 1901. Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Notre Dame, J.P. Dolan, wrote of the diocesan priest from Ireland. York emphasized the natural human rights tradition that Leo XIII had incorporated into his defense of the workers. The organization of labor unions was a natural human right, not a pragmatic concession to troubled times. A quarter century after the letter, witnessed to our goodwill by Pope Leo XIII, Catholics in America were still Catholic. In the 1920s, during the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, Catholic immigrants were in their crosshairs. Here we see the American ideal of religious pluralism being tested. First, here on the left, the political cartoon is titled, "This Tree Must Come Down." We have the Klansman with an axe. And who is the tree? Well, we have the Holy Bible at the top, Rome, and then three almost like demon-like looking friars. On the right, one of my favorite stories. Up there in Indiana, in South Bend, where the University of Notre Dame's located. At the time, it was an all boys college or all male college, and the Klan came to town and was going to walk the campus there to intimidate the students. And the president of the university, a Holy Cross priest, really stated, "Hey guys, go into your dorms, relax. It'll all blow over. They're a whole bunch of jerks. Don't give them any attention." And what happened was the next day during the big parade through South Bend, the students dressed up as Klansmen and cornered a lot of them and beat the pulp out of them. The Klan and its hate was not relegated to the South this time, as we just saw in that previous example in Indiana. What young Thomas Wall experienced at Boston's Eliot School in 1859 spread west, as migration did. Even in my own backyard at Burlingame, California, in 1925, some cowardly Klansmen in full regalia shouted and honked their cars and burned a cross at the Convent of the Mercy Sisters at Cole Mansion. In Oregon, the voters passed legislation to Americanize Catholic immigrant children by requiring all children to attend public schools. The Sisters of the Holy Name of Jesus and Mary would have none of it, no pun intended. In 1925, their case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Pierce, Governor of Oregon, et al., versus Society of the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. The victory was won based on the constitutional guarantee of religious freedom. On the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Pope Pius XI penned The Reconstruction of the Social Order. Author Charles R. Morris argues that Catholic alternative to excesses of social communism and socialism and communism and capitalism grew out of its organic theory of society. This organic theory included a family wage, a father working, no need for wives and children to work, adequate free time for religious and family duties, and that the father working must faithfully discharge duties, and that strikes were to be used as a last resort to achieve justice. Morris quotes economist Barbara Ward, who wrote the following in 1939, that Catholic thought aims above all at balance, the balance achieved by combining planned economy with individual freedom, state control with private ownership, economic independence with political needs and social justice. The Reverend Clyde F. Cruz, author and theology teacher at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky, writes that Roosevelt's New Deal fit closely with the Catholic social teachings of the popes, most notably Leo XIII and Pius XI, and writes of the influential Father John A. Ryan that he would influence the bishops' social statements, the bishops in the United States, of 1919, observed in 1934. Never before in our history have the policies of the federal government embodied so much legislation that is of a highly ethical order. Alfred Emanuel Smith was an American politician who served 4 terms as governor of New York and was the Democratic Party's candidate for president in 1928. Here we see a political cartoon from a Ku Klux Klan publication suggesting the Pope was the force behind Al Smith. Here you can see the Pope with the papal tiara blowing up a balloon representing Al Smith. This anti-Catholicism seen from the good citizen was not sporadic, but embedded in the dominant Protestant culture in the United States, as seen in many examples presented here. It had a long history. University of California at Santa Barbara historian Philip Wayne Powell wrote in his 1971 book titled Tree of Hate, quote, "Hushed whispers about secret preparations in Catholic churches for the great takeover when Al Smith would become President of the United States. And horrifying pictures of Inquisition tortures were paraded in New York to thwart the Smith candidacy." End quote. The nation would have to wait until late 1960 to elect its first Catholic president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We see him here in Maine, leaving church after Mass with his sister Patricia Lawford in 1962. As alluded to earlier, in 1931, Pope Pius XI promulgated the reconstruction of the social order. Church teaching on solidarity, expressing that Catholics are our brothers and sisters. Expressing that Catholics are our brothers and sisters keepers wherever people live and whoever they are. Here we see an image that is emblematic of the response to migration within American borders and from without. Photograph here, white tenants seeking to prevent African Americans from moving into the Sojourner Truth homes. How ironic is that? A federal governmental housing project erected this sign: "We want white tenants in our white community." This is January 1942 in Detroit, Michigan. Once again, Sojourner Truth homes. Surely Catholics were among those protesting. The next image here on the right, a photo by Dorothea Lange, deals with the braceros, Mexican laborers, many of whom were Catholic, who were allowed entry into the United States to fill jobs vacated by native-born American men fighting in World War II. The Bracero Program was a series of laws and diplomatic agreements initiated on August 4, 1942, when the United States signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement with Mexico. The agreement guaranteed decent living conditions, such as sanitation, adequate shelter, and food, and a minimum wage of 30 cents an hour. The Bracero program would last until its termination in 1964. In 1947, Archbishop Joseph E. Ritter instructed that to integrate Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of St. Louis will happen. Pictured here are white Catholics who opposed the Archbishop's instructions. They are leaving a meeting attended by 700 at the St. Louis House, 2345 Lafayette Avenue, on the evening of September 21, 1947. It was the third such large gathering of angry parents who threatened to remove their children from Catholic schools and planned a lawsuit to block Ritter. At the time, segregation of schools was Missouri law, but the morning of the big meeting, a Sunday, Ritter had all priests read a letter during all masses. It threatened excommunication to anyone who took part in such a lawsuit. The letter threw the meeting into turmoil, and the new segregationist organization, known as the Catholic Parents Association, disbanded 2 weeks later. Being a Catholic and Navy veteran, this story is really special to me. The SS Meredith Victory was a United States Merchant Marine victory ship, a type of cargo freighter built for World War II. Under the leadership of Captain Leonard LaRue, the Meredith Victory is credited with the largest humanitarian rescue operation by a single ship, evacuating more than 14,000 Korean refugees in a single trip during the Korean War. The vessel has often been described as the Ship of Miracles, as it was designed to carry only 12 passengers with a 47-person crew. What a great example of faith in action by a layman. After the war, LaRue entered St. Paul's Abbey in Newton, New Jersey to live out his days as a Benedictine monk. Another layman whose story inspires me is boxing champion Floyd Patterson, pictured here on the right. In the February 2020 Columbia Magazine article titled "Knights Who Shaped History," Patterson is described not only as a legendary athlete, but also a man of profound faith. The article explains, quote, Patterson strongly promoted civil rights and integration despite opposition. In 1957, a hostile crowd of white locals impeded his arrival in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where he had a scheduled stop on an exhibition tour. A priest, himself an integration supporter, intervened, bringing Patterson and his entourage to the church and hosting them at the rectory. Soon after, Patterson demanded integrated venues for boxing. The article continues that Patterson later traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, standing with Martin Luther King Jr. amid death threats, and he decried his opponent Muhammad Ali's embrace of the Nation of Islam for its divisive outlook on race, stating that it preached hate and separation instead of love and integration. While heavyweight champion Patterson converted to Catholicism in 1957, he later joined the Knights of Columbus in New Paltz, New York, and became, in biographer W.K. Stratton's words, a mainstay of Knights events. He also helped the parish by distributing Holy Communion at the local nursing home, calling himself, quote, the Eucharistic minister with the biggest hands, end quote. Despite his love of his sport, he once mused that if the church forbade boxing, he would give it up. When an interviewer later recalled these words for Patterson and asked if his faith was still strong, he replied that it was even stronger, end quote. At one time in California, it was against state law for Caucasians to marry people of other races. That is until a very courageous Catholic couple, Andrea Perez, a Caucasian, and Sylvester Davis, an African American, will challenge the law. They wanted to marry in the Catholic Church and were allowed to by church officials. But before their nuptials could take place, they had to get their marriage license from the state, and there they were denied. They fought it, arguing that by denying them a license, it also forbid them to get married in the Catholic Church, thus having the government restricting their religious freedom. In 1948, the California Supreme Court found in Perez v. Sharp that the state law broke the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution. This case was a prelude to Loving v. Virginia in 1967, where the U.S. Supreme Court forbid anti-miscegenation laws, or marriage between race laws. At the time, 16 states still had such laws on the books. I believe these three images really capture the cultural shifts in America. Here we see Father Patrick Peyton's Rosary Rally at the Polo Fields in Golden Gate Park, October 7, 1961, with 500,000 Catholics in attendance praying the Rosary. Just 6 years later, 20 to 30,000 young people would gather at the same location the Rosary Rally took place, but for the human being, a rejection of middle-class morality. It was between these two events that the Second Vatican Council took place. Pictured here is the papal bull, Humanae Salutis, with which Pope John XXIII solemnly convoked the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council on December 25th, 1961. Here we see Cesar Chavez with Coretta Scott King and Dorothy Day at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, February 20th, 1973. The three Christians from diverse backgrounds, one a Catholic Mexican and labor rights advocate, the other African-American Baptist and civil rights leader, and a Caucasian Catholic convert who cried out for justice for the poor, are seen here together praying for justice. Dr. Ann Kledgman, professor at St. Thomas University, wrote in the introduction of her summer 2011 U.S. Catholic Historian article titled Dorothy Day and Cesar Chavez, American Catholic Lives in Nonviolence, that it was, quote, a Catholic president's call for sacrifice that inspired their participation in projects of social reform and economic development at home and abroad, end quote. And of course we know that Catholic president was the one and only JFK. This justice would not come without challenges, however. This event in Catholic American history resonates with the one that took place in the Archdiocese of St. Louis presented earlier, but occurred nearly 3 decades later, and this time in New England. Pictured here are police taking a woman away as they break up a group of 800 anti-busing demonstrators in South Boston on October 7th, 1974. Some citizens were not ready for government integration of public schools through busing. A 1974 New York Times article titled From the Schools to the Streets noted that Cardinal Humberto of Boston, a Portuguese American, strongly supported desegregation busing and refused to let parents enroll their children in parochial schools as a means of avoiding it. Personally, some events really stand out to me while growing up, and they all center around the model Church as Sacrament. It was a time of transition in the Church. Vatican II had ended just a few years before I was born. As a young boy, I had the pleasure of knowing the Sisters of Notre Dame at my school, and an Irish priest and a French-Canadian priest. First, the Irishman, Father Corcoran, who told my class when preparing to make our first confession that we can speak to God at any time, but that it is also very good and special to talk to others. Speaking to God in the confessional and receiving absolution from his church's minister is the most special way to speak with God. So, why was this noteworthy? Because being a young Catholic, I thought you could only talk to God while in the confessional. At my first communion, I received the Blessed Sacrament at the altar railing. Soon thereafter, it was removed, and the altar moved forward and then surrounded on all 3 sides. I also remember as plain as day being taught by the sisters how to receive the Eucharist properly, thus reverently. Here I'm pictured, I think about the year 1980, and yes, this is me, at my classmate's home for a class Mass with the French-Canadian Father Dominique Deschardins. This was foreign to me, having Mass at my friend's home. I could only wonder how foreign it was to my parents, who were brought up when the Mass was said in Latin. Since it is my favorite area to study, I have to sneak one more example of the theme Church and State in. The United States had diplomatic relations with the Papal States, or the Holy See, from 1797 to 1867. The Papal States ceased to exist in 1870, however, when its last territory, the city of Rome, was lost to the Kingdom of Italy and Garibaldi. After that, the international status of the papacy was controversial until 1929, when the Italian government, under Mussolini, agreed to the establishment of Vatican City as a sovereign city-state. In 1952, President Truman wanted to have an envoy at the Vatican. He nominated World War II hero General Mark Clark, who was voted down by the Senate amid hysteria in Protestant circles. It would have to wait until President Reagan in 1981, when formal diplomatic relations between the United States and the Vatican started once again. Pictured here is Pope John Paul II in Miami with Ronald and Nancy Reagan in 1987. Pope John Paul II had also seen Reagan during his 1984 trip to the United States. Demographically, America has changed since colonial times. Here we see from the U.S. Census Bureau 2010 census, ancestry with largest population in country, African Americans, American Indians in orange, British, purple, French, German, mainly in the Midwest, Irish, Italian, Mexican or Spanish, mainly in the West and Southwest, Scandinavian, the green, and other Chinese in San Francisco County, Cuban, Miami-Dade County mainly, the Dutch, Ottawa County, Michigan, and Sioux County, Iowa, Polish in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, and the Portuguese in Bristol County, Massachusetts, and Bristol County, Rhode Island. The same could be said for the Catholic Church in America. These numbers come from CARA, race and ethnicity of U.S. adult Catholics, also based on the 2010 census. Non-Hispanic Catholic white, 58%, Hispanic Latino, 34%, African American, 3%, Asian, 3%, American Indian, Alaskan Native, 1%, and Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, 1%. I'll stop there because, one, I've been going for over 50 minutes, but also the history about my generation has to wait to be written by the next generation. I would like to conclude with the following from Thomas Merton, also known as Father Louis, who was an American Trappist monk, writer, theologian, mystic, poet, social activist, and scholar of comparative religion. He wrote, "The big problem that confronts Christianity is not Christ's enemies. Persecution has never done much harm to the inner life of the church as such. The real religious problem exists in the souls of those of us who in their hearts believe in God and who recognize their obligation to love Him and serve Him, yet do not. Maybe this is the inspiration we need, who see the study of Catholic history as complicated. Like my student wrote, the Catholic religion is a, quote, large, complicated book. But he also said it is a powerful way to make it less complicated is to learn from the faithful disciples who have walked with Christ. Maybe the saints of America will motivate us to not just believe, but also act. Like Saints Isaac Jogues and Pedro Calungsod, who never gave up bringing the gospel to those he served, even if it meant martyrdom. Or Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, the first canonized Native American saint, who never lost faith in God, even if it meant being ostracized by our own people. Or Saint Junipero Serra, who traveled more than Marco Polo to bring the gospel to total strangers. Or Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, the founders of Catholic schools and first person born in the United States canonized in the Church. Or Saint Damien of Molokai, who at great sacrifice ministered to the lepers in Hawaii. Or Saint Francis Xavier Cabrini, the Italian immigrant who ministered to her fellow immigrants and was the first naturalized U.S. citizen canonized in the Church. Or Saint Catherine Drexel, the heiress who used her inheritance to minister to Native Americans and African Americans. Let us pray that they help us to be wise, understanding, have right judgment, courage, knowledge, reverence, wonder and awe as we learn from the past, see the present as a gift, and hope for a brighter future. Clifford out.